What happens when you point the finger at your husband, only for him to uncover your betrayal instead? What if his revenge isn't yelling or violence, but calm, legal action that strips away everything you thought you controlled? This is the story of how I lost my marriage, my dignity, and my family's respect in one stroke of lawful payback. My name is Corinna Vale. I'm 34, and I ruined everything by trying to get ahead of my own guilt. I thought if I accused Julian, my husband, of cheating first, people would believe me. I told my sister, my friends, even his mother, that he was sneaking around. I painted myself as the victim so no one would look too closely at what I was doing. The truth was, I was the one sending late-night messages, sneaking out after work, laughing at my phone when I should have been with my family. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just attention, just something I needed to feel alive again. But Julian's silence became dangerous. He didn't fight back the way I expected. He didn't defend himself loudly enough for me to feel safe. Instead, he watched, and he waited. Now the papers are on the table. Everyone has seen the proof, and I'm the one being judged by the very people who once comforted me. It started at home, in the place where I had always felt I could control the story. Julian had just finished work, his shirt still tucked in, glasses sliding down his nose, as he sat at the dinner table with Sophie and Theo. Evelyn, his mother, had joined us that night because she insisted on seeing the kids midweek. I remember setting down the pasta dish, smiling in that tight way I used when I was hiding something. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message I didn't dare check with everyone there. Elias again, no doubt making me feel wanted, in ways Julian hadn't lately. But instead of staying quiet and pretending life was normal, I decided to strike first. I had been carrying the weight of my secret for weeks, and I convinced myself that the best defense was a good offense. If I made Julian look like the unfaithful one, then no one would question me. That's how I justified it. So, while Sophie told a story about her teacher, I cut in. I sighed loudly and said Julian had been acting strange, secretive. I said I felt like he was hiding something from me, maybe even another woman. The words dropped into the air like stones. Julian froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He asked slowly what I was talking about. I leaned back, arms crossed, and told him that I could see the signs. The late nights grading papers, the way he guarded his phone, the distracted look on his face. I said no man changes habits like that unless something else is going on. Evelyn's eyes narrowed immediately, fixed on her son. Sophie looked at me, wide-eyed, and asked if Daddy was in trouble. Theo just poked at his food, sensing the tension. Julian set his fork down carefully and said he hadn't been hiding anything, that I was imagining things. His tone was calm, almost too calm, and that only pushed me further. I accused him again, louder this time, telling him he was making me look like a fool in my own home. I even added that if he truly had nothing to hide, he wouldn't be so defensive. The truth, of course, was that I was the one who had something to hide. I had been meeting Elias for coffee, for lunches that turned into long afternoons. I had been telling Julian I was working late when I wasn't, but none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was convincing everyone else that Julian was the liar, not me. Rachel, my sister, wasn't at the dinner, but she had been on my side for weeks. On the phone earlier that day, she told me I deserved excitement, that Julian was too dull, too predictable. I carried her words like armor into that dining room, ready to strike. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice sharp. She asked Julian directly if what I said was true. I watched her turn on her son with suspicion, and for a moment, I felt powerful. I had managed to make him the focus of doubt. That was exactly what I wanted. Julian didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or slam his fist. He just looked at me across the table with an expression I couldn't read. Then he stood up, pushed his chair back quietly, and walked out of the room. The sound of the door closing behind him was almost gentle, but it cut through me sharper than shouting would have. Sophie's voice broke the silence when she asked if Daddy didn't love Mommy anymore. I forced a smile, patting her hand, and told her not to worry, that sometimes grown-ups just needed to talk. But inside, my heart was racing, not because of guilt, At least that's what I told myself. But because of the way Julian had left without a word. His silence wasn't relief for me, it was a threat. I turned back to Evelyn and said, maybe she should ask her son what he was really up to, since I clearly wasn't getting the truth. She looked at me like she wanted to believe me, but there was doubt in her eyes. That doubt stung, because I needed her completely on my side. After the kids went upstairs, I leaned into the role I had created. I told Evelyn that Julian had been distant for months, that I felt invisible, that I had begged him for more attention and he ignored me. I said I wasn't crazy, that I knew when a man was keeping secrets. Every word was half true, twisted into a weapon. Evelyn didn't defend him, but she didn't defend me either. She just sighed and said, maybe it was time to have a serious conversation with her son. That wasn't enough for me. I wanted her outrage, her condemnation, her full weight pressing down on him. Instead, she stayed measured, which only made me more determined to spread my story wider. When Rachel called later that night, I told her what had happened. I said Julian stormed out after I confronted him. Rachel laughed bitterly and said that was proof enough. She said men like him always run when they're caught. Her words soothed me, made me feel justified again. But as I lay in bed alone that night, staring at the empty side where Julian should have been, unease gnawed at me. He hadn't argued. He hadn't denied too hard. He hadn't even defended himself to his mother. He had simply walked out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't running away. He was planning something. Still, when morning came, I plastered on a brave face and told Sophie and Theo that Daddy was just busy with work. I rehearsed lines in my head for the next time Evelyn questioned me. I even practiced sounding hurt, betrayed, and righteous, because I had to keep the story alive. If I didn't, the truth, that I was the one betraying him, would come crashing down. And I wasn't ready for that, not yet, so I doubled down. I told myself Julian's silence meant guilt. I told myself Evelyn's hesitation meant she believed me deep down. And I told myself that Rachel was right. Men like Julian never stay loyal for long. The problem was, none of those stories were true, and deep inside, I already knew it. But once I spoke the accusation aloud at that dinner table, there was no going back. I had cast Julian as the villain, and I couldn't undo it without exposing myself. That was the night everything started to unravel. Not for Julian, but for me. And I was too blind to see it. The next step in the story I spun happened at a restaurant a week later. It wasn't planned, not really. A group of us had arranged to meet for dinner. Mutual friends from the neighborhood, a mix of couples and singles. Julian agreed to come, though he was quieter than usual in the days leading up to it. I remember looking at him as we got ready, buttoning his shirt with that same steady calm that always unnerved me. I told myself he was guilty and that his silence was proof. What I didn't admit, even to myself, was that his calmness scared me more than if he had shouted. When we arrived at the restaurant, the table was already buzzing with conversation. People greeted us warmly, but I felt an odd energy, like they were waiting for something. I slid into my seat and ordered a glass of wine, telling myself this was the moment to secure sympathy. If I could make everyone laugh at Julian's expense, they'd believe my version of events without question. So, while menus were still being passed around, I leaned back and sighed dramatically. I said Julian had been acting like a mystery man lately, slipping out early in the morning, staying late at school, keeping his phone glued to his hand. A few chuckles went around the table, and that gave me courage. I added that maybe he had a little side project he wasn't telling me about. I said it with a smirk, letting everyone interpret the implication. Julian didn't say a word. He sat across from me, his eyes on the table, swirling the water in his glass. That silence only emboldened me. I laughed louder and told our friends that if he didn't have anything to hide, he wouldn't be so protective of his phone. Someone shifted uncomfortably beside me, but I pressed on. I even mentioned Elias by name, though not as my affair partner, of course. I called him my work friend, who actually knew how to listen when I needed to vent. I made it sound harmless, but the message was clear. There were men who paid attention to me, unlike my husband. The words slipped out smoother than I expected, and for a moment I felt powerful, like I was finally controlling the narrative. But then, the laughter died down. One friend coughed awkwardly, another changed the subject quickly. The air grew heavy. I tried to play it off with another joke, but the mood had shifted. Julian finally moved. He set down his glass, folded his napkin neatly, and stood. He didn't look at me or at anyone else. He just said he was leaving. His voice wasn't angry. It was calm, almost detached. Then he walked out of the restaurant, leaving me sitting there with my wine glass half raised. For a few seconds, no one spoke. All eyes turned to me. I shrugged, rolled my eyes, and told them he was just sensitive, that he couldn't take a joke. I tried to laugh it off, saying men always get defensive when you hit too close to the truth. But no one laughed with me. They just went back to their food, murmuring quietly among themselves. Inside, I felt a flash of panic. His silence again. It wasn't the silence of guilt. It was the silence of someone who had already decided something. But I shoved that thought down and poured myself another glass of wine. I told myself I had won the round, that everyone had seen how defensive he was, and that would stick with them. Later that night, I called Rachel and told her what had happened. She laughed on the other end, saying Julian leaving like that was the clearest sign he had something to hide. She told me I was smart to keep pushing, that men only crack under pressure when they're guilty. I let her words soothe me, even though I knew the looks on our friends' faces hadn't matched her enthusiasm. When I got home, the house was dark. Julian's shoes were by the door, but he wasn't in the living room. I checked upstairs. His side of the bed was empty. I told myself he was sulking, that he would come back once he realized how foolish he looked walking out like that. But as I lay in bed alone, the silence pressed down on me again. I tried to convince myself it meant guilt, but deep down, I couldn't shake the fear that it meant something else entirely. Preparation. Still, the next morning, I walked into the kitchen with a smile, telling Sophie and Theo that Daddy had just gone to work early. I rehearsed my lines again, convinced I could keep control if I just kept talking louder than the truth. What I didn't see yet was that Julian had stopped playing my game, and that meant the rules were about to change. The cracks in my story began to show not in front of strangers, but inside the quiet walls of our home. After that dinner at the restaurant, Julian barely spoke to me. He went through the motions, helping Theo with homework, reminding Sophie to brush her teeth, paying bills at the desk in the corner, but his eyes never lingered on me. It wasn't the cold shoulder I expected. It was worse. It was like I had become invisible to him. At first, I told myself his silence was another form of guilt. He couldn't defend himself, so he withdrew. That's what I told Rachel when she asked how things were. She agreed instantly, saying men always hide when they're caught. But even as she spoke, I could hear the hollowness in my own defense. Julian didn't look like a guilty man. He looked like someone studying a problem carefully, waiting for the right moment to solve it. Meanwhile, Elias kept messaging me, quick texts during the day, little jokes, compliments about my hair, my laugh. He asked when we'd meet again. I fed on those messages like oxygen. When I stayed late at the dental office, I told myself it was harmless. Just coffee, just conversation, just feeling alive for a while. And when Julian asked why I was coming home late, I rolled my eyes and told him he was paranoid. I said he should be grateful I worked so hard for our family. The words came out sharp, meant to shame him into silence. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and went back to whatever he was doing. That quiet nod was more unnerving than any fight. The children, in their innocence, became the weak point I hadn't expected. One evening, as Evelyn joined us for dinner again, Sophie piped up with a bright smile and said, "Uncle Elias has a really nice car." My fork clattered against the plate. Evelyn's head turned slowly toward me, her eyes narrowing. I asked Sophie what she meant, my voice too high, too fast. Sophie said simply that Elias had picked me up from work once and let her sit in the front seat when we stopped for ice cream. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't ask who Elias was, didn't demand answers. He just kept eating, calm and deliberate, while Evelyn's eyes bored into me. I laughed it off, saying Sophie must have been confused, that she mixed up names all the time, but my explanation sounded weak, even to my own ears. Evelyn didn't push the point, but I could feel her suspicion settling over me like a storm cloud. Later that night, I tried to scold Sophie for making up stories. She looked at me with wide, hurt eyes and said she hadn't lied. Guilt pricked at me for a moment, but I shoved it down. This was about survival. When I went to grab my phone from the counter, Julian was standing there. He wasn't snooping, he wasn't angry, he was just watching me. His eyes were steady, too steady. My stomach flipped. In that instant, I knew he had seen something, maybe even everything. Messages I hadn't deleted, words that gave me away. I clutched the phone to my chest and asked why he was staring. He said nothing. He just walked past me upstairs, leaving me with a heart pounding so hard it hurt. I told Rachel about it the next day. I said Julian was playing mind games, trying to make me nervous. She told me to stay confident, to double down. She said men like Julian break only if you keep pushing. Her encouragement felt thin, but I clung to it anyway. At work, Elias started pulling back. He said I seemed distracted, that he didn't want to get caught in something messy. I snapped at him, telling him he had begged for my attention for months, and now he was scared. He apologized, but his tone had shifted. I could feel his exit already. At home, Julian's silence deepened. He helped with the kids, paid the bills, smiled politely at neighbors, but with me he was a wall. No anger, no affection, just distance. I wanted him to shout, to accuse, to give me something I could twist against him. Instead, he gave me nothing at all. That nothing grew heavier every day. It wasn't the silence of guilt anymore. It was the silence of a man building something I couldn't see. The worst moment came one night when I woke up thirsty and went downstairs. The glow of his laptop lit the living room. He was typing, scanning documents, his face calm and focused. When he noticed me, he closed the screen gently and said he couldn't sleep. His tone was normal, almost casual. But I knew then, he was preparing. For what? I didn't yet understand. I went back upstairs, lay in bed staring at the ceiling, clutching my phone like it could shield me. For the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe my story wasn't as airtight as I thought. Maybe my performance at the dinner table and the restaurant hadn't been enough to keep suspicion away. Maybe Julian wasn't the one trapped in my lie. Maybe I was. The breaking point came at my parents' house. During a Sunday dinner, I convinced myself I could manage. I told myself this was my chance to control the narrative again, to remind everyone that Julian was the one at fault, not me. If I could get my parents on my side, if I could get Rachel to echo my words in front of them, then Julian would look isolated, outnumbered. I rehearsed it in my head all afternoon. I was the wronged wife, the loyal mother, the woman ignored by her husband. That was the role I had to play. When we arrived, the table was already set. My parents welcomed us in, but there was tension in their faces. Julian carried the salad into the dining room, quiet as ever, while I helped my mother with the last touches. Rachel was already there, sipping her drink, giving me a little nod of encouragement, like she knew exactly what I planned to do. We sat down, the kids chatting happily, oblivious to the storm beneath the surface. I opened the show quickly. I sighed loudly, said Julian had been distant for months, that he barely spoke to me anymore, that he made me feel invisible. I looked straight at my parents and told them I had begged him to spend more time with me, but he was always too busy, too tired, too distracted. Julian sat across from me, calm, his fork moving slowly from plate to mouth. He didn't protest, didn't roll his eyes, didn't even look angry. That stillness unnerved me, but I kept going. I said sometimes I wondered if he even cared about our marriage anymore. Rachel jumped in right on cue. She said I deserved better, that a woman my age shouldn't feel like a ghost in her own home. She said maybe Julian didn't realize how lucky he was. I nodded along, grateful for her reinforcement. My parents exchanged glances but said nothing. Then Evelyn, who had been invited too, cleared her throat. Her voice cut through the air, sharp as glass. She asked why Sophie kept mentioning a man named Elias. She said children don't invent names out of thin air. The entire table froze. My fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. I forced a laugh, saying Sophie was confused, mixing up names like children do. I insisted she must have overheard something at my office, maybe a patient's name. But Evelyn didn't look convinced. She turned her gaze directly on me and said plainly that Julian wasn't the problem here. My cheeks burned. I scrambled for control, insisting that yes, I talked to Elias, but only because Julian had pushed me away. I said it was innocent, that I just needed someone to listen when my own husband wouldn't. I said Julian's coldness had forced me into loneliness. Every word was a half-truth, twisted, until it sounded like justification. My mother shifted uncomfortably, my father avoided my eyes, and Rachel jumped in again, saying I was right to seek comfort, that neglect can be just as harmful as betrayal. But her voice sounded thin against the weight of the silence that followed. Julian set his fork down neatly and folded his hands. He still didn't look at me. He didn't defend himself or argue with Evelyn. He just let the silence grow heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, the doorbell rang. My father excused himself, returning moments later with a man in a suit holding a large envelope. He walked straight to me and placed it on the table. My name was written across the front. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside were divorce papers, formal, legal, detailed. Attached to them were printed screenshots. My messages to Elias, the jokes, the emojis, the complaints about Julian. My own words laid out in black and white, undeniable. I felt the blood drain from my face. The children looked confused, asking what was happening. Rachel leaned forward, trying to peek, while Evelyn sat back with a grim expression of satisfaction. My parents stared at me, stunned into silence. I looked at Julian then, desperate for a reaction, for some flash of anger or sorrow I could use to fight back. But he didn't even meet my eyes. He stood, thanked my parents politely for dinner, and walked out the door. The papers shook in my hands as I tried to speak, to explain, to twist the story again, but no one was listening anymore. The evidence had spoken louder than I ever could. And in that moment, I realized my performance was over. The role of victim no longer fit me. I was the villain, and everyone knew it. The days after that dinner blurred together in a haze of panic and denial. I left my parents' house clutching the envelope like it might dissolve if I held it tightly enough. I told myself Julian was bluffing, that he wouldn't actually go through with something as final as divorce. But the weight of the papers in my bag said otherwise. At home, I spread them across the kitchen table, staring at the cold, precise language. Dates, times, screenshots attached as evidence. My own words printed in neat black ink. There was no room to twist or deny. Still, I told myself I could talk my way out. If I reached Julian first, if I cried enough, if I begged, he might reconsider. But Julian didn't answer my calls. When he did reply to one of my frantic texts, it was a single line. Everything goes through my lawyer now. The calmness of it gutted me. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't stalling. He was done. Rachel tried to comfort me, saying men always swing hard before they back down. But her voice sounded less certain now. Even she had seen the papers at the dinner table. Even she had read the truth in my expression. Slowly, she stopped returning my calls as quickly. The one person who had been in my corner was slipping away. Meanwhile, Evelyn wasted no time spreading her version of the story. Friends who once laughed with me at restaurants now avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Neighbors whispered when I walked past. I felt their judgment on my back like heat. The narrative I had worked so hard to control had shattered overnight. I tried reaching Elias, desperate for him to say something in my defense. His phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message begging him to confirm that it was just harmless fun. Nothing serious, nothing worth ending a marriage over. He never called back. A week later, one of my co-workers mentioned he had transferred to another office. Just like that, he was gone. And Julian was moving with terrifying efficiency. I heard from a mutual friend that he had been visiting a lawyer's office downtown, carrying folders filled with documents. He requested financial separation, custody planning, and protections I didn't even know existed. He wasn't lashing out, he was building a fortress. When the next envelope arrived, I nearly collapsed. It was a formal petition for primary custody of Sophie and Theo. Attached were logs of times I had missed pickups, texts where I claimed to be too busy while meeting Elias. I had told myself those little lies were harmless, but on paper, they looked damning. They looked like neglect. I tried to spin it again, telling my parents Julian was exaggerating, that he was using the kids as weapons. But they didn't look at me with sympathy anymore. My mother said quietly that children notice more than we think. My father said maybe Julian was right to protect them from the chaos. Their disappointment cut deeper than anger ever could. I even called Julian's lawyer once, begging for a meeting. The man's voice was calm, professional, and unyielding. He said all communication would be handled formally, that I would have the chance to respond in court. I hung up shaking, realizing how little control I had left. At night, I lay awake listening to the silence of the house. Julian no longer slept beside me. The kids clung to him during visits, their laughter brighter in his presence than it had been in months. I told myself they were too young to understand, that they would forgive me one day. But the truth was in Sophie's guarded looks, in Theo's questions about why Daddy didn't live here anymore. The walls of the life I had built were closing in. Every lie I had told, every accusation I had thrown at Julian, every smug smile I had worn in public, it all came back, piece by piece, in documents and whispers and looks of disappointment. One evening, I sat alone at the table again. The divorce papers spread in front of me, my phone silent. I tried to convince myself Julian would calm down before the court date, that he still loved me enough to hesitate. But the memory of his steady, silent eyes told me otherwise. He wasn't coming back. The worst part was knowing that this wasn't an impulsive choice on his part. He had waited, gathered, prepared. He had let me build my story higher and higher, only to pull it out from under me with one packet of evidence. And now, with custody papers in hand, I realized he wasn't just ending our marriage. He was taking back his dignity in the most devastating way possible, through silence, through proof, through the law, and I had nothing left to fight with. The final blow came in the courtroom, a place I never thought I'd see myself. I had pictured yelling, tears, chaos, something dramatic I could twist into sympathy. But what happened was worse. It was calm, orderly, and merciless. Julian arrived early, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt and dark jacket. He carried a folder under his arm, his face composed, not a trace of the man I had mocked in front of friends. I expected him to look at me, to flinch, to show some crack in his resolve. He didn't. He nodded politely in my direction, like I was nothing more than a stranger sitting on the other side of the room. My lawyer whispered strategies, but my mind buzzed too loud to hear them. When the judge entered and the proceedings began, Julian's lawyer spoke with precision. Dates, times, evidence, screenshots of messages between Elias and me projected for the court to see. Records of missed pickups for Sophie and Theo. My own excuses preserved in writing, twisted now into proof of neglect. I tried to speak, to explain, but the judge reminded me to wait my turn. My lawyer argued I had been under stress, that everyone makes mistakes, that the affair was a lapse in judgment, but not reason to dismantle a family. I nodded through tears, clinging to those words. Then Julian spoke. His voice was steady, clear. He said he wanted stability for the children, a home free of confusion and humiliation. He said he had no wish to destroy me, only to protect Sophie and Theo. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The truth was already written in the documents, in the witnesses, in the silence between his sentences. When I finally had my chance, I tried everything. I said I had been lonely, that Julian had withdrawn first, that Elias had been nothing but a distraction. I cried that I still loved my husband, that I only wanted our family whole. The words tumbled out, desperate and tangled, but they sounded weak against Julian's calm restraint. The judge listened patiently, then read from the paperwork. Primary custody awarded to Julian, with visitation for me. Financial control transferred to him, leaving me responsible for my own debts. The gavel struck, and in that sound, my entire world collapsed. I turned to look at Julian, waiting for some reaction, anger, sadness, even relief, but he didn't glance my way. He gathered his folder, thanked his lawyer, and walked out of the courtroom with his mother by his side. Sophie and Theo were waiting in the hallway, their little hands reaching for him. They barely looked at me. The silence of that moment crushed me more than any screaming match ever could. He hadn't needed to fight me. He had simply let the truth catch up, and when it did, he stepped out of the wreckage untouched, while I stood in the middle of it, exposed. When I returned to the apartment that night, it was colder than I remembered. Every corner felt hollow without the kids' laughter, without Julian's steady presence. The papers from court sat on the counter, stamped and signed, undeniable. I picked them up, read them again and again, as if the words might change if I stared long enough. But they didn't. I wanted to call someone. Anyone. Rachel had stopped answering regularly. My parents were polite but distant. Elias was gone. Even Tasha, a casual friend who once egged me on, had vanished when the truth came out. There was no one left to tell my side of the story. All I had was silence, and in that silence, the truth finally settled, like a weight I could no longer shove aside. I had accused my husband of cheating to protect myself, but it was me all along. I had humiliated him, mocked him, painted him as the villain, and he had waited, watched, and chosen the only revenge that truly lasts, dignity, backed by law. The story ended not with shouting, not with violence, but with a calm judgment that left him walking free and me sitting alone, clutching papers that proved I had destroyed myself. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.